briefing. My name is Khatijah, and I'm actually one of the Vice President of Quality Research Association, and I'm very privileged to be here with you to actually share these three distinguished speakers' sharings of their knowledge. First of all, we actually have Prof Tong Seng Fah. Prof Tong Seng Fah is presently our President of the Qualitative Research Association Malaysia. Currently, she's an academician from the Primary Care Physicians Department of Primary Medicine in University UKM or National University of Malaysia. And his research interest actually includes doctor practice in health screening, in men's health, and also in chronic care. He has very special interest in grounded theory as a method and a methodology to understand behaviors among people, really. So he is actually, and he has conducted several workshops. I think most of you or some of you would have actually attended his workshop. He has been actually very actively doing workshops and roadshows for the associations. So, and he also is a past president of the Malaysian Primary Care Research Group. So, and Prof Tong is going to actually share her knowledge about coding. Sorry, I lost my track on theory and coding, which is very important. Now, our second distinguished speaker is no other from Professor Stephen Krauss Abdullah. Assalamualaikum. Prof. Stephen actually is a professor with the Department of Primary Development and Continuing Education in the Faculty of Education Studies in UPM, which is University Putra, Malaysia. So his teaching and scholarship center around growth development in human resource development, and also, of course, qualitative research methods. So she has been teaching a lot in University Putra, Malaysia in terms of qualitative methods since 2006, and also currently teaches a course in advanced qualitative research methodology for PhD students in University Putra, Malaysia. And his current research focus on interest on the role of youth-adult partnership in enhancing school engagement among secondary school studies in Malaysia. Our last but not least is Dr. Ng Lee Luan. My apologies. Dr. Ng Lee Luan is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Language in the Faculty of Language and Linguistics. And Dr. Ng actually obtained her doctorate in Applied Linguistics from the University of Otago in New Zealand. And apart from supervising master's and PhD students, she has been teaching a lot in postgraduate courses related to research method, social dimension of language at the Faculty of Language and Linguistics, University of Malaya. And her current research interest includes blended and online learning, which I think is what we are all involved in now, digital translanguaging, and also schooling related to issues of indigenous children. And currently, he is also a member of the University Malaya Research Ethics Community for the non-medical studies, and also a certified trainer for the for NVivo software for analysis of data. So I would like to actually remind the speakers that they have 20 minutes to actually present their presentation. And Prof Tong will go first, followed by Prof Stephen, and then last but not least, Dr. Ng, and we will have question and answer time at the end of it. Please note that, I would like to remind you all to mute your mic when they are presenting to avoid any disturbance. And secondly, there is for the Q&A, please post your questions in the chat, or you can actually email us in QRA it's QRAmalaysia@gmail.com. And also we will have an evaluation form for you at the end of this forum, which we will actually QR code it and put it for the end of the session for all of you. So with that, happy listening, and I would like to actually invite Prof Tong to actually share her slides. So the floor is yours, Prof. Tong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patty. And yeah, I hope you can see my screen. I'm just putting up my share screen. And thank you, QRAM, for organizing this e-forum. And I'll kickstart by talking about theory and coding. Hope I can keep it to time. And this is often a delusional topic sometimes. And we're going to address two of the questions that I intend to. The first is, do I need a theory for coding in qualitative research? This is often being asked in many of the workshops when we conduct how to analyze data. And of course, the second question I would like to address is, what is the role of theory in coding? If we need theory in coding. So let's give you an example. What is coding? Sorry, we could start with what is coding, because just to set the stage correct, and we are on the same page. Coding simplistically basically means that's a meaningful label, all right? Meaningful label put in a piece of text. Although there are many different definitions of what coding is, but by and large it's similar, that it put a label to some form of narrative, text, or artifacts, whatever it's going to be. But this definition doesn't really help us a lot, isn't it, for a novice researcher, how to go about, okay? Let's give an example. Let's give this is a text, or this is just an artifact or pictures, whatever you call it. Basically, let's say we go ahead and start coding. So often we are given this piece of data, so to speak. We often face a large query, how to go about, and what are we supposed to code? And we know this is fruits because they are very common to us. But for people who come to a new piece of data, how to go about? So often we say code must come from a research question. Okay, so we're going to have some research question. If we have a research question like this, you might have a directions of how we're going to code. What types of fruits we have? You can describe it in many ways. Okay, local, foreign fruits, imported, export fruits, and local fruits, taste, colors, things like that. There are so many ways to code this data. So I often put this up in my class, and I have varied answers, in a way. This is one of the groups that I managed to pull out. So from the left upper panel, you can see their colors. So basically this participant, one of the students will code it according to colors. The other side on the right top hand corner, you will see codes by taste, can't read that. Yeah, smells, textures, things like that. Whereas on the left lower code, you can see they are grouped into notions, health benefits of fruits. So there are many ways of coding. So the first question we will ask is which one is correct and which is not correct. If you ask us, these all are correct description of the fruits. So what the point is that when we code, we already have some theory behind it, isn't it? If you look at it, there are some assumptions. Why are they coding according to colors? Because at the back of the research minds on that day, he probably think about, okay, we should describe it as color. So the perspective is towards color. The other one is towards the taste, textures, things like that. So if you ask us, do we actually do it without any theoretical background? If we quietly think about it, we already put in our own perspective assumption. In fact, some of us will argue, okay, we are not going to put any theory. That itself, it's already an assumption you are making, right? So if you look at this coding example by Johnny Sardana, and he clearly described that if you look at a piece of data, we always look through a theoretical lens, right? So if you look at the first text, second text, and just it's the same text, but because of different theoretical understanding, you're going to have a different possible codes. So it is very tricky. Of course, it's very tricky. So were there ever actually influence of us coding without a theory behind? Is a big question, right? Recently, we conducted a study interviewing people behavior during MCO. Sorry, there's a typo there. During movement control order during March time started. And this is a piece of data we have gotten. So it says our children, my daughter-in-law aren't from KKM, because this particular participant is from KKM. KKM stands for Ministry of Health. And I really explained which went shopping, you took back some stuff, how long you leave it, you need to wash it, even outsiders, you know, and then I'll say that I'm from KKM staff, things like that. So I guess this piece of data, how do we code it? How do we code it? We can code it in a sense that what people do. So you can advise family members, advise Voxing, felt qualified to advise, and advise outsiders. You know, all those sort of things they are doing that because we are asking for what do people do. So what do people do itself is already a perspective. How about if you're looking for meaning? If you're looking for meaning, then perhaps it's slightly different, it's labeled. Okay. Let's bring you through another interesting thing. If you look at this piece of data through a theory, this particular theory is really from health perspective, and it talks about health behavior. Okay, health behavior. So it says that we must perceive something that is severe enough before we take on a positive health behavior. So anything positive, severe or susceptible to something, for in this case is infection, then we must perceive something that must be beneficial, some action must be beneficial. Then we can go on with some health behavior. So if we look at this piece of data, of course, this particular participant think that, okay, we are susceptible to COVID, therefore we must take precaution. So you can code it as perceived susceptibility or perceived benefit of washing. Here is a clear example of how some theory has influenced the way how we look at data. Okay, but this is very explicit. Okay, sometimes these things of theory and assumption, it comes very implicit, and we sometimes don't even realize we already taking our lens to look at things around us. Okay, so simplistically, theory is used, is inevitable, it's everywhere. It's not a matter of choice. You have been using it. If you look at how you look at the world around you, the piece of data, evidence you collected, you collect it with a purpose. You already put down your own perspective to it. You like it or not, you choose to collect certain form of data. Here, coding is the same. If you choose the way how you look at the data, that's it. So whether you realize whether you look at it through your lens or not. So assumption cannot really be separated. Your prior knowledge, how can you erase your memory? You know, it's very difficult. And your prior experience, assumption about the world surrounding you. So I guess it is a little bit misnomer to say that we are going to really ground and being so inductive. Even so inductive, there are a certain form of assumption we carry, the baggage that we carry, right? It is so not so much about the problem, but we just realize it. Just have to realize our baggage. So we can and should acknowledge our assumption. Therefore, it put forward how we can look at the data. Okay, so this is what recently I've read about the theory and coding, and it correctly pointed out that your own idea said, I am not going to be influenced by past experience. The notion of that itself is already a theoretical disposition. So it is never actually separate for ourselves, the assumption and theory behind us. But that goes another question. Assumption, is it assumption called theory? So like perspective, are they called theory? So a lot of arguing about how do we define theory. So what is theory anyway? So perhaps we should look at closely what is theory. Okay? If you look at the loose meaning of theory from dictionary, okay, it says that it's just a system rules, a procedure or assumption used to produce a result. So your perspective, your stand is a form of theory, if you like. Okay? Of course, there are more stricter definition from scientific definition. You can see from the left-hand side, that is more encompassing, okay? It talks about substantiated explanation from past research, for example, in order trying to explain the phenomena around us. Okay, that's the more encompassing theory. On the right side, you have more restrictive definition. It is more from a perspective on positivist view. A theory must be able to identify laws, okay? They can predict behavior, right? It is context-free. So when you talk about context-free, it is very difficult. It means that this thing has to be put into the laboratory that we can prove it in some way. But as you know, there are different paradigm or assumption about the world of knowledge that you know out there. Okay, so you can choose either definition people have put forward. But what does it mean to us? If you look at all these strict definition, loose definition, and things like that, and also definition talking about theory, about knowledge, things like that, you can easily grade this theory in different level. So I would like to put up the level of theories, currently some authors there. And the theory can be very broad. For example, a paradigm, okay, is a very general form of theory. You know, it very general, is really capturing a huge amount of phenomena around us. Okay, it is a theory about knowledge. Okay, what constitutes knowledge? What is reality anyway? That itself forms the meta theory. Okay, broad theory. And then we have, going down the list, you can see different examples I put up. This is not exhaustive. There are many, many more. So to a level of micro theory, okay, I will briefly go through this, each of it quickly, and hopefully I won't spend too much time on that. So meta theory really talk about assumption about knowledge. What do you assume knowledge about to be? You know, what is the truth about knowledge? So, but this particular assumption doesn't give you a way to explain the world a lot. You know, how do I explain my behavior? Okay, this assumption or this meta theory doesn't explain my behavior. Okay, so but it gives us a broad base so that we can anchor our research on. I'll tell you a bit more later as we unfold discussion. Then we come to grand theories. Grand theories, you know, this 1, 2, 3, 4 that I'm going to talk about, they really don't have a clear border. But for the sake of classifying that, we do have an artificial category. Okay, so grand theories are concepts that are abstract, and it also can explain a specific phenomena, but across different disciplines. Symbolic interactionism is one of that. It talks about meanings, you know, how people construct meanings and how people formulate their activities around those meanings. So by talking about this, sometimes it takes us, you know, some time to digest what is symbolic interactionism means. And sometimes you have to read pages in order to try to understand what symbolic interactionism means. Because this is an abstract concept, it doesn't connect you with things happening around the world. Okay, things happen around so easily. So therefore, this grand theories sits, if you like, really on top, you know, try to explain many things altogether. But because of that abstract level, it has problems of specificity to specific phenomena. So you go down to mirror range theory, which coming close to you. So those teachers out there and educators out there, you might be very familiar with adult learning. So we know adult learning talks about, you know, it is a kind of way how we behave ourselves, in a way trying to progress from one stage to another in gaining knowledge. So it talks about practicality, self-directed, relevant. So at the go, you can see, oh, I see, adult learning actually adopt a problem-oriented manner, task-oriented manner. So very easily you can connect this theory with our daily. But this theory really talking about specific human experience, which is learning. It doesn't encompass broad range of phenomena. So on the right-hand side, you also have a reason-action approach, which is another theory explaining research action, right? So micro theory, or this is what we have just seen just now, is really a local theory that really explains even more specific, not just behavior, but preventive behavior. Preventive health behavior to be even more specific. Originally developed for vaccines, for example, usage, right? So it's very specific to explain specific phenomena. It allows us to grasp the concept easily, and we can understand it quite easily by quickly look at it. So there are different levels of theory. So if there is different level of theory, do I need a theory for coding? Yes, you always look at it from different perspective. So how do we use it then? That's a question. What is the role of theory? Okay, and at what stage coding that I'm embarked with theory? Okay, so those are the questions that, you know, some of us doing analysis might need to understand. So if we understand the whole range of theory, how do we build in the spectrum of methodology and coding? So if you look at methodology, we look at, you know, you can look at methodology typology differently, different types of methodology characteristic. But I'm just going to take a relevant stance from inductive to deductive stance. So what does it mean? Even though qualitative, they are inductive, more slant towards inductive methodology. For example, grounded theory, inductive thematic analysis, phenomenology, narrative inquiry, ethnography, and many more. They are more inductive in a sense. Grounded theory is a classic example saying that, okay, I'm not going to use any theory. I'm going to ground my analysis from data. Even the originator of grounded theory start like that, but at some point of time, there's a strong influence of symbolic interactions within grounded theory. So we can't say grounded theory is really a methodology without theory. Itself is built on some broad, grand, and those assumptions. Yeah. So on the right-hand side, deductive methodology, those who embark on deductive thematic approach, codebook-like analysis, framework analysis, even case study, there's some form of theory as being explicitly said in its methodology. So there's a slant towards deductive range. So if you can look at your own methodology, you may want to decide, are you more inductive or deductive? Why is it important to look at it? Because theory influences the way how we look at methodology. So from inductive, you're going to tend to use more paradigm and grand theory. Deductive, you really have to identify more local relevant theory. So if you embark on any quality research methodology and without knowing what theory are you using or what paradigm are you using, it can be sometimes very difficult. It makes you lost in the way of analysis. Okay. And now we go to the stages of coding. Yeah, of course, there are different stages of coding. You have first level to third level or fourth level, if you like. The first level is very inductive in a sense. Merriam has put up very inductive sense where you just discover. And then as you group and categorize, you actually move on to more deductive method, okay, more deductive method. So as you go up, you will form categories and you test your category with your own data. And we always talk about iterative ways of coding, and that is exactly what it means. But putting it, how does it relate to theory then? So if you look at the stages of coding, you're going to have initial coding, grounded to data, more descriptive. Then you have more analysis at the end, okay, more abstract driven. And with that, you can't avoid, but sometimes you need to be more analytical. And that's where deductive thinking sometimes come in. You may pull some theory to make your analysis even sharper. So theory helps you to make your analysis sharper, but it also have a danger of constrain your thinking. Okay, you can't get out of the box. So that's a way of, adaptive thinking. You choose what theory I'm going to use. So this is often a very difficult question. It have to depends on your experience and also your reading. Abductive thinking basically means you just look at your data and through the stages of coding, you will just intuitively think, okay, what theory that click with it? What theory resonate with my data point? So then you see whether the theory able to illuminate your data better, go slightly deeper. So, but always initially, if you embark on a very much inductive procedures, you need to look at it from more grounded way, more grand theory, and more paradigm. Okay, are you positivist, negative? Because it influences a lot of way how you analyze your data. So I'm coming to the end actually, and I just bring you a quick example. Okay, just let you read the text on the left-hand side. It's one of the texts that we pull up from one of the projects. Yeah, basically talking about barrier inquiry about men's health in a doctor-patient consultation. So participants are doctors. Just let you read for a while. Okay. So basically, this is a question asked, when do you start asking about sensitive issue of men's health? So you're talking about this, she's talking about her experience, talk to a religious man, so-called the ustads, and then he got scolded from the experience. So the initial quote, if you are approaching in the grounded theory method, so well, people say there's no theory, but there is actually some form of way how we look at this piece of data. So basically, we are describing what's happening in this action. So this is the potential codes that can come out from the data. You can challenge these codes because everybody look at data slightly differently, all right? So if you move on to the next level analysis, you can see, okay, if I'm from a medical background, therefore I will see diabetes, we know is associated with erectile dysfunction a lot. So we know, okay, people with diabetes, we definitely have to ask ED. So we weigh the medical importance of asking ED among diabetic patients, okay? So we have that assumption in mind that I know, okay, this particular doctor weigh a medical importance of ED. And then you go on to talk about being scolded, bring up sensitive issue. Basically what it means is they are not very receptive to screening. So there's receptive agency that you read about, oh, okay, this particular piece of data actually bring out the issue why patients being scolded, doctor is being scolded by patient, because the sensitivity and patient is not ready to receive that kind of query. But you look at weighing medical importance and receptivity. How does doctor actually decide what to ask and what not to ask? Then I thought to myself, okay, there's probably a decision theory they can use. So illuminate us by thinking broadly and intuitively what can explain this piece of data. So at the end of the day, even my research question had changed. Not just barrier, it's about when the doctor decide to talk about men's health. So that comes up with the use of different theory as we go along. It is still a very much inductive initially, so we still ground our theory on the data, but from the perspective, different perspective. Okay, people who from ethnography, for example, they might be very different in the ways of coding. At the end, their theory will be different. The result is different. Mind you, it's not just grounded theory, produced theory. Many methodologies produce theory as well. You see, so this is the picture that nicely put. If you have a methodology or study that have embarked on high use of theory and you have a robust methodology, you actually can explain your phenomena very well. Otherwise, you will probably just report whatever without much use of theory. So, or rather not quite sure what are using. So that is even worse. You're not sure what you're doing. So a lot of time it's just reporting. So qualitative work become very boring, and then it doesn't illuminate us the phenomena around us. Okay, so there are different matrix, the different quadrant you can look at it. So without theory and without good methodology, you're not going very far anyway, right? So answer the two questions: do I need theory? Of course, we always look at it from a different perspective, our own perspective. You can't look at the world without your own perspective. It's very difficult. Bracketing is there, but bracketing is always now is being debated whether we can really bracket ourselves. Okay, so what is the role of theory and coding? Of course, you got to look at inductive or deductive. Then you can maneuver what theory are you going to use and whatnot. It's better to be clear about your stand, okay, rather than ignoring your stand and then claim that you don't have a stand. Yeah? You don't have a theory behind you. That's probably quite a big error in assumption. So we call analysis without theoretical analysis in the vacuum of knowledge. You can't get out from that. There must be an anchor point. So that I'll end my discussion on theory and coding quickly within 20. Hopefully I make within time. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Thank you, Prof Khatijah. Thank you, Prof Tong, for inviting me. Always a pleasure to be at a QRAM program and to be among fellow qualitative researchers. So although we can't be together in person, at least we can be together in some form. So nice to see everyone. So to follow up Prof Tong's presentation, which was very beneficial to me, it's ironic because I got the topic of subjectivity in coding, issues and challenges. And in fact, one of the issues in coding has much to do with what Prof Tong talked about just now, which is on theory. So there might be a little bit of overlap in our presentations. I will try to extend it in a little bit of a different direction, but definitely theory is one of the ways that we deal with subjectivity in coding, because as we know in qualitative research, everything we do is considered to be more towards the subjective. And so how we deal with that subjectivity in the process of interpreting data in order to do coding is what I'm going to sort of try to address in my 20 minutes, which is another challenge. So the issue is on interpretation in the process of coding, and then the challenge is doing it in 20 minutes. Okay, so and so briefly, I'm not gonna belabor definitions too much. Prof Tong gave us some very good definitions about coding and what it is. I think it's quite clear from his presentation. But the main coding dilemma is that coding is an act of interpretation, and how we go about doing it is going to very much dictate the quality of our studies in qualitative research. So we have to deal with this dilemma of how we deal with the subjectivity in the process of coding and in that act of interpretation. So I'm going to sort of emphasize that. And then I'm going to give two sort of strategies, hopefully, and in these 20 minutes on how we can deal with this challenge. So as Prof Tong mentioned, coding essentially is, as you see here, examining a portion of your empirical material, whether that's a word, a paragraph, a page, depending on how you're conducting your study, how you're analyzing your data, and labeling it with a short word or phrase that summarizes the content, okay? So embedded in that definition, as you see, is it's implied that there is this act of interpretation as we do our coding. And so how we go about doing this summarization of our qualitative content is going to be very much dictated with all the things that Prof Tong talked about, especially the role of theory, and some others as well. Now, when we do coding, we have to first understand that words have meaning, okay? And we are in the position of trying to make sense of what experiences our qualitative participants are going through. And the words that they're using, it's our job to sort of represent them and to make sense of them. And so I would argue that, and this is often stated in the literature as well, that qualitative research delves a lot into the act of crafting a study and crafting an analysis as much as it is science. And we emphasize that qualitative research is scientific. It is a scientific method, but it also does require a considerable amount of craft and artfulness on how we go about arguing for our findings. I like to equate it sort of to the lawyer in the courtroom who's presenting their case in front of a jury, right? There is no necessarily way to say whether the lawyer is presenting what he's doing is he's creating a case, right, using a variety of different types of analysis and a variety of different types of evidence, and that's essentially what we are doing in qualitative research as well. Okay, so whatever you are coding for, whether it's discourse, social construction, lived experience, coding enables us to really immerse ourselves in the data. It allows us to pull the data apart, to begin to look to discover patterns at different levels within the data, within the sort of overall narrative that's been presented to us. And it's a way of putting together that jigsaw puzzle. And I like to think of codes as sort of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we try to put together to form this narrative whole, right, of what is the experience or what is the phenomenon that we're studying. Okay, so coding allows us to do that, to sort of deconstruct, reduce the data into smaller pieces so that we can begin to put together a larger coherent story. And by looking at each individual sentence or paragraph or whatever it is that we're coding, it allows us to make a judgment about meaning. Okay, so this is where interpretation comes in. Essentially, what we're doing when we're doing coding is we are interpreting. It's sort of the first level, the first phase of interpreting our data. So the dilemma, the issue, if you will, words have meaning, but how do we decide what they mean? And that is essentially the dilemma that we face when we engage in qualitative analysis and especially coding as the first level of analysis. I would like to segue that, however, by emphasizing the fact that not all qualitative traditions do coding. And in fact, recently in the literature, there's been sort of a little bit of a backlash against coding by some scholars due to the fact that coding has become sort of ubiquitous throughout the field. But for some traditions within qualitative research, like discourse analysis, hermeneutic phenomenology, they don't really do coding. They analyze their data differently without the use of coding. So this assumption that everybody does coding is actually not the case. Coding and interpretation are not distinct phases, but they're interrelated processes, okay? So coding and interpretation of data go together. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to begin to put together or present two strategies to deal with this issue of subjectivity of interpretation in our coding. Okay, so the first one, and some of this is going to be familiar to similar to what Prof Tong has presented, but the first one is very important, and what Prof Tong presented is very important. The role of theory. In addition to theory is our own stance and background. Okay, so several scholars, including Baptiste and Saldana, talk about different considerations when we go into our analysis of data, okay, including our coding. The first one being philosophical, okay, so there's a philosophical consideration. There's the design consideration, okay, in terms of the method that we choose, the research questions, and so forth. And then there's the contextual considerations, okay? So all three of these can be dealt with early on, before we begin our coding, to clarify how we're going to go about interpreting our data. Okay, so let's start with the first one. In terms of philosophical considerations, our own personal values and beliefs, okay, and similar to what Prof Tong just touched on in terms of our assumptions, our history with the topic, okay, what is our stance on interpretation? What is our stance on the role of the researcher, on how we go about defining what is relevant data, okay? I often see this in my experience teaching, and I get students that come from sort of quantitative backgrounds, for example, more positivist backgrounds. Their stance on interpretation is very conservative in the sense that they are very much sort of hesitant to allow their own interpretation of data um, without it without it touching on what they consider to be bias, for example. Okay, so all these ontological and epistemological questions also will color how we go about coding our data. Okay, our own personal interests. Okay, our personal biases, our personal assumptions, okay, our history with certain theories, okay, our use of certain theories, our own experiences, okay. If we're a teacher of 25 years of experience and we're studying teachers in schools, you know, that massive extent of experience is going to definitely affect and influence how we go about interpreting our data and thus coding our data. Okay, so these personal interests have to also be, of course, taken into consideration. And then, of course, our ideological stance and our theoretical positions. Okay, and this is what Prof. Tong talked a lot about. So, for example, if you have an Afrocentric feminists, okay, interpreting a certain text, they're going to look at the data quite differently from analysts who subscribe to something like a neoliberal or a postmodern ideology. Okay, so these paradigmatic as well as more theoretical issues are definitely going to color how we see our data and how we code our data. Okay, so Saldana talks about the lenses of the analyst, right? The different lenses that we have or that we wear when we look at data. Okay, and so these are very much also colored by our theoretical positions, as they should be. Now, the point here is that we need to be clear about these things before we go into actually coding our data. And that will help us to base our interpretations on something more sound, something that can be considered as a stronger interpretation. Okay, and this has been written about in the literature, a strong interpretation versus an interpretation that's not as strong. And I'm going to get into that a little bit in a minute. In addition to philosophical considerations, there's our design considerations. Okay, and so first and foremost, of course, when it comes to study design, is the nature of our research questions, okay? And Prof gave us a good example of that. What is the goal of the analysis? Is it to describe? Is it to interpret? Okay, is it to identify the structure? Is it to pull out values of our participants? What is the goal of the analysis according to the research questions? And for those of us who have been involved in qualitative research, we know that our research questions are sort of like our GPS for our study, right? It keeps us on track, it keeps us guided. And so those research questions also should dictate how we go about coding our data. Choice of method, okay? What is the methods approach to coding? Grounded theory, you're gonna start with open coding, right? You're gonna do maybe some in vivo coding as well, okay? If you're using a more deductive approach, like Prof talked about, you're gonna do something like template coding or structural coding, okay? So choice of method, phenomenology, grounded theory, what have you, is also gonna dictate how you do coding. As I mentioned before, some methods don't even do coding. They use other ways of analyzing at the introductory level, different ways of analyzing their data. Okay, so whatever research design you are using is also going to affect how you code. And then how much subjectivity is allowed by the method. Okay, so if you're looking at doing transcendental phenomenology versus hermeneutic phenomenology, okay, these are very different schools of thought in terms of how they go about analyzing their data. They wouldn't even really call it coding, okay, but the amount of the researcher's own subjectivity is an issue of debate within these two schools. Hermeneutic phenomenology really emphasizes the role of the researcher's past experience and theoretical biases and so forth, whereas transcendental is the one that really advocates for bracketing of all those things. Okay, so they have very different ways of looking at subjectivity in the context of analysis and coding. So what method or what design you're using is going to also influence that issue. And lastly, contextual considerations. You as the analyst, okay, your own knowledge, your own skills, your own preparation, training, and so forth should also influence how you go about coding your data. What an analyst can do in a specific context depends on these things, depends on your respective knowledge, skills, confidence level, your training, and so forth. These things should be considered when you go about designing your study and deciding what type of coding you're going to do, all right? Or whether you're going to use coding. Okay, so for example, if you're very new to qualitative research and you're doing maybe a short-term study, maybe you're not going to want to get into something like autoethnography or hermeneutic phenomenology, something that's more complex and involves a lot of subjectivity. You're going to do something much more straightforward, perhaps. But these are also considerations that should be made. Okay, so ironically, I've actually pulled out the same example that Prof Tong did, but it's a good example for all these things. Okay, so for example, he talks about coding filters, and here what he's doing, he's giving a very good example of how the same data can be coded very differently depending on these three considerations: philosophy, design, and context. Okay. So he calls them coding filters, and these are the three things that actually sort of filter how we look at data for our coding. Okay, so this same text here, there's just no place in this country for illegal immigrants. Round them up and send those criminals back to where they came from. So the first one is looking at it from a grounded theory perspective using in vivo coding. So he's obviously, or she's obviously, using the text from using the text itself to code the data. So no place, okay? And that's the way in vivo coding is done. Now, we don't know here the theorists, the analysts' own their background, their personal background and so forth, but we know here from at least from the perspective of design, clearly they are coding in line with their grounded theory approach. Now, the second one, same data, but this one is an urban ethnographer. And this urban ethnographer is employing something called descriptive coding. Okay, so the same data, but the resulting code here is immigration issues, right? There's just no place in this country for illegal immigrants. Round them up and send those criminals back to where they came from. This is an urban ethnographer looking at the breadth of opinions stated by their research participants. Okay, so here they are focusing on the immigration issues, and for an urban ethnographer, it makes a lot of sense because they're dealing with immigration issues all the time in urban ethnography, right? The composition of cities, how people get along in cities, the culture of city life, and so forth. All right, so it makes a lot of sense that they would be coding that as immigration issues given their coding lens and their background. Now, the third one, a critical race theorist employing values coding, codes the same text as xenophobia. And of course, like when I read this text, that was my initial knee-jerk reaction. Wow, this is a really xenophobic kind of comment, right? Now, I got to get in touch with my own biases, okay? So in this particular case, the critical race theorist who is looking at values, is looking at these types of, looking at racism, at xenophobia, and all those things, and they're going to code it according to the values that sort of emerge from the data, okay? And so this is a very, of course, these are all subjective perspectives, okay? Given and based on the perspective where the researcher is coming from, according to those three elements that I've mentioned before, okay? So you can see, even it's just 2 sentences, very small bit of text, but coded 3 very different ways, and all acceptable. No one would argue that these are incorrect or weak interpretations. These are acceptable interpretations clearly as the data is as presented. Now, the second part of this issue of interpretation is what is called strong interpretation. And this was sort of Gabriel wrote a very nice piece on this. Coding as an act of interpretation. It is subjective, yes, but is it effective? Okay, is the interpretation effective? So when interpreting text, new evidence can shift the meaning of an interpretation. Okay, so interpretations can change based on the quality and the quantity of evidence. All right. One of the reasons why when we talk about rigor and trustworthiness in our studies, we always have to look at whether the evidence that we present is convincing. We hear that all the time. Is it convincing? Are you convinced when you read the finding, right? Does it have credibility? Does it have dependability? Does it have confirmability? All these things. Is it convincing? Okay. And that's based on the quality of the interpretation as based on the evidence. Okay. Not all interpretations are equally meaningful or valid. Okay. You can have an interpretation that's original, clever, perceptive, incomplete. It can even be plain wrong. People can actually misinterpret. Okay. And it is done quite frequently, actually. All right. Based on the evidence presented. While no interpretation can be proven per se, again, think back to the lawyer in the courtroom, every interpretation can be corroborated through a variety of techniques. And so this is sort of the argument for triangulation, for example, using different data from different sources, using different types of analysis or different types of ways of collecting data and so forth, we can begin to corroborate our evidence to make a stronger interpretation. All right, so here subjectivity is enhanced and is strengthened through these different methods that we use, okay, or different types of data, different sources of data, okay, the corroboration of a variety of techniques and different types of data. What is strong interpretation? Okay, well, some of the ways that we can ensure strong interpretation, where when our codes begin to work together to form an overall narrative, okay. Prof Tong emphasized the importance of in his last slide, coming up with a finding that's really rich, that really explains the entire phenomenon, not just bits and pieces of it. And this is sort of the why there's such a backlash now against coding from a lot of quarters within the field, is that they find that coding tends to break up our findings into little bits and pieces. So we risk not presenting a coherent whole finding that really explains our phenomenon in a singular rich manner. Okay, so this is what the danger is. So codes need to work together. They need to come together to form an overall sort of narrative, an overall explanation of whatever phenomenon we're studying. Using negative cases. Okay, so here the researcher sort of acts as a devil's advocate against their own interpretations, seeking to identify clues that would undermine or discredit their interpretation. So you have to be your hardest critic as the analyst, okay? Here's where reflexivity comes in and all that. We have to constantly ask questions of our analysis, of our coding, okay? Are there different ways of explaining this, okay? Are there cases that sort of prove or show that our interpretation is actually wrong? Okay, so we actually seek out negative cases, okay? And this is a common approach used in grounded theory, but it can be used in other traditions as well. And can this interpreted coded data be done differently? Okay, when we begin to eliminate the potential counter interpretations, that's another effective way of corroborating our interpretation, okay? So again, asking questions of our findings. Could this mean this? Could this mean that? Is it possible it means this? Okay, constantly interacting, engaging with our finding, with our coding, to help us to know whether we have arrived at a strong interpretation, or is it just full of holes? Okay, is it full of holes, full of possible alternatives, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, and this will help us to enrich our analysis. So I'm just going to close with an example of how we can be transparent in this process of strong interpretation. How do we present? How do we show? How do we illustrate strong interpretation? So a scholar by the name of Glenn Bowen produced a very nice article in 2008 on how the article is really about how to illustrate grounded theory, saturation in grounded theory. And he gives some tidbits and he has some nice examples of how you actually can illustrate these things in a written piece, whether it's a thesis or an article and so forth. And so he really shows here how we can present our evidence of strong interpretation using excerpts from our audit trail, really. And so the first one he gives is a line-by-line coding example. Okay, so he takes an excerpt of his coding from the interview data, and he shows exactly how he did his line-by-line coding. Okay, and so we can see here clearly how the researcher is interpreting his coding, at least at a micro level. Give us an example of that. And then from there, he goes on and in building his case, he shows how the interpreted codes fit within the larger whole of the finding. So how his codes come together to form themes, all right? And the categories of his theory on the left, okay? So here he begins to build up his finding by showing the culmination of codes into larger categories, okay? And then finally, he shows us the whole from the preliminary codes all the way to his categories and his themes. And he also shows how the codes fit together with other forms of data. Okay, so here we have field notes, we have interview transcript, we have data from newspaper. Okay, so we're making use of triangulation as well. But it shows how the codes and the interpretation of his codes fit within the larger whole of the finding. Okay, and so this is a very effective way of being transparent in going about showing our interpretation and sort of establishing that idea of strong interpretation. Okay, the more we can do this, the stronger our study will be at the end of the day, and more easy to defend our findings. Okay, and so I think with that I have come to the end. I think I did it. 20 minutes. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm talking about CAGDAS and its use in assisting coding. By the way, before I start, are you okay? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Ng.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
All right. So basically, what is CAGDAS? If you look at the screen, it's computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. So here, just go to the next one. So if you look at this, I think all of us wish that this would happen when we do our data analysis. So here you can see that, the smiley face telling you that the positive pattern is coming. And of course, sometimes you feel like doing this. I know my students hate this word insights because they have no idea what it is. And sometimes it just like, really make them very frustrated. So I think some of them will be in such position, like threatening the data so that the data will give them insights. So here we are talking about analyzing qualitative data. And the question right now is, good old Shakespeare. If Shakespeare says to be or not to be, that is the question. Then for us is to use or not to use CAGDAS. So what is it that we're looking at actually? So if you look at the qualitative analytical process, we have this. So you have the major component, the procedures and the outcomes. And of course, the components, we have that tree: data reduction, data display, conclusion, and verification. In terms of procedures, when we are analyzing the data, these are some of the things that we do with the hope that we would have description of data that would allow us to have explanation and interpretation for our readers. So where does CAGDAS come in? Here, all right? So this is how CAGDAS is supposed to help. So how does CAGDAS help then? So let's look at the first function. Mostly is to deal with large amounts of data, allow us to do that, and reducing the amount of time needed for manual handling of tasks. That means we cut down on clerical stuff. So as a result, it allows us more time to attend to the real world work of analysis. It also provides more rigorous analysis via providing us more flexibility and thoroughness. So here you can see that data can be coded in multiple ways. We can code one word to many ideas if they are related. And we can merge, delete, move data quite easily. And also we can go beyond textual data. For instance, right now, we can straight go for the PDF documents. We can study picture, audios, videos, even websites tweeters, right? And data can be searched very easily, and ideas about the data can be linked. Another great functions of Cactus is this one. It enables researchers to visualize their findings. So for instance, here, a pattern can be shown in form of matrices, charts, word cloud. I'm going to show some example later, all right? So just bear with me for a moment. And codes can be cross-matched with demographic data. So last time, SPS for quantitative SPSS, the demographic data is very important because that's the one they try to figure things out. But right now, even for qualitative with Cactus, you can easily take into account demographic data to find your patterns. And of course, you can develop graphical representations of models and ideas. Another function that is helpful, it provides for Cactus, it provides more visible audit trail in data analysis. So for instance, we can have memos, journals in our project file. We can attach analytical writing information as we develop our ideas and analyze our data. So here I'm going to show some examples from NVivo because I'm a trainer of NVivo, so it is easier for me to just pick examples from NVivo to showcase what are some of the functions of Cactus. So if you look at this, coding and showing of text can be done quite easily. If you look at my screen, you can have different coding stripe, so can easily go from code to code and to find which tag have you coded with what code. You can even code straight onto video and audio without having to go to transcription. You can capture certain instances and start coding. And also, of course, retrieving or coding is so simple. You just have to double click. It will just pull out everything that has been coded with a particular idea. Another way, remember we talked about showing patterns. Yeah, Cactus is very good at doing that. It will produce all kind of matrices or tables to show pattern. And you can see, you can even change the color, of course. And text search is another function, which is very good. So just like Microsoft Word, you can actually tell Cactus to say, show me all the instances when you see this word A. And then in fact, like for software like NVivo, it actually can create a word tree for you. And pattern of data shown via table and chart. I think I've said that before. And also via, charting. Yeah, it's not only table, but charts and even 3D charts. Word cloud is another wonderful functions. For example, you can just tell Cactus to show me the count of all these words, and it'll count for you. So like in this instance, the higher the count, the bigger the word. And you can just click and it will tell you exactly where this word exists in your data. Visualization, of course, like here is showing you relationship of your code and your cases. And of course, like for individual case, what has been attached to this case, how many codes, what are the demographic data, the age, and so on. Collaboration, I think, is another wonderful function that is provided by Cactus. For example, you can have in-text communication between team members. As you can see, I can attach a comment to some word, and then whenever my co-researcher open the project, they can see, they can respond to the comment. So you don't really have to be doing it simultaneously. You can do it asynchronous and it still makes sense. So after saying about all this wonderful thing about Cactus, I think it's only right. We also talk about the possible pitfalls of Cactus. Now, I'm a trainer for Cactus. Despite the fact that I know the many wonderful functions of Cactus, I'm also aware of some of the problematic areas for some people. For instance, focus of analysis may not be on quality. Some people are so engrossed in coding, they forgot about the whole point of coding. So it's just like counting how many codes do I have. So as a result, you are looking at breadth rather than depth, and sometimes that's not a good thing. Another thing is about being drowned in codes. Yeah, like you have situation because like a lot of CAC like NVivo, it's so easy to code something. It's so easy to code something to any new code. You could easily produce few hundred codes in a day. And that is also a problematic area because you find yourself drowning in the number of codes. And most importantly, you cannot make sense of these codes. And that's not going to be good. Also, people may not be able to see, or researcher may not be able to see the conceptual forest. They only see a lot of trees, but you don't see a macro view of things. So because you are going down to the codes and you are counting, you are doing this and that, sometimes you forgot to take a few steps back and look at it and that, how does this make sense? How does this allow me to answer my research focus? Sorry, somebody's talking. And then what are the possible pitfalls at CACDAS? Another one is making analysis rigid and flexible. Now, some critics say that, as a result, having to come out with coding framework, you are confined and that, your brain is not free up to look at other things, anything that's outside the box. So it can be a straitjacket. And overemphasis on coding and retrieval can also miss us, as I say, miss the essence of meaning in data. Yeah. And the code may become the objects manipulated by researcher, and more we divorce ourselves from their context. And I think as a qualitative researcher, it's very crucial for us to always understand the data in context. Last two pitfalls. A lot of people feel that, oh, I'm using CACDAS. That means, my analysis is perfect. It's wonderful, but it's not, right? It's just a process. It's just a tool. It cannot be representing the quality of analysis. Just like SPSS, you've got rubbish in, rubbish out. Same thing with CACDAS. And finally, this is more about money. Whenever there's a new improved version, some people feel that, they need to buy the newer version. They have to pay for the update without understanding whether it is necessary for them to do that. Because like SPSS, actually, if those functions in the older version that you can use, you don't really have to keep updating your software by paying the company. I'm saying that because I don't work with the company, okay? So if you look at this, this is a saying, money is a tool that can either fix or damage your life. Use it wisely. My advice is, CACDAS is a tool that either fix or create problems for your research. So use it wisely too. And I like to talk about this. This is a pet peeve of mine, so please indulge me. If you look at this screen, this is a Swiss Army knife, right? It comes with various functions. And I think CACDAS should be treated as such. We shouldn't be using CACDAS for one specific reason, just to analyze our qualitative data. Actually, CACDAS as a tool should have a lot of visibility that we can use throughout our research journey. For instance, before the data analysis, we can use CACDAS to reconceptualize our idea, keep track of our reading, do note taking, even code our literature review. That means we code the files that we read, the PDF files. During data analysis, we can use it to maintain collaboration with members, not just for analyzing the data, as I've shown you in one of the previous slides. It can also be used to determine the content for reporting later on. Yeah, you can use some of the functions to start planning how you're going to write your chapters, your article. And after data analysis, this is what you can do. You can use it to manage your writing. You can use it to draft for specific sections of your method, and so on and so forth. So another one of those, money is an important tool for modern life. Money will not make you happy, but you can use money wisely to enhance your happiness. What I'm saying here is this one. And then you can read for yourself. So I think you have to use CACDAS wisely to enhance your happiness, in this case, by enhancing your data analysis and research process. If there's any last message that I would like to share with all is this table. And I've given you the source. And these are some of the pertinent questions you can ask yourself before you choose CACDAS, or which CACDAS, and how you're going to use CACDAS to help you. I can share this table with the organizer if you like. And that's it. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for your patience. And I'm so glad I managed to do this with you finally today. Thank you.